Well, going hopefully. Great. So welcome everyone. For those who have not met me, my name is Jay, Jay Sloan. My pronouns are they, them. I am currently one of the co-chairs, but also one of the co-leads for programming for the Proud Science Alliance. And if you don't know anything about the PSA, we are an organization that really aims to raise the bar on LGBTQ plus inclusion across the life sciences and healthcare sectors. And we offer programming just like this and also support to the various network organizations that are part of our network. And if you're interested in who those might be, it's all on our website. Also, just to mention, we also have another co-sponsored event with the Francis Crick Institute this next week. If you're London-based or around London, you can check that out looking at our social channels for details. It's an evening in-person event, which is somewhat rare these days, but they have a couple of amazing speakers really focusing around LGBT History Month. And it's a great way to also connect with others in the community. Today, though, we're going to take a look into our LGBTQ plus history. And part of the focus, because we're a life sciences and healthcare based organization, is really with that lens. And so you'll notice a lot of content related to that today. I also, because I think it's really important to also understand a little bit about, I guess, the queer rights movement, we'll end on sharing a bit of information about that. And I'm just inviting people. Before we get into it, though, I think one of the things that I've come across, particularly in the last, say, 2 or 3 years, is this idea or these comments, maybe even I've seen it in the media around, oh, all of this, particularly like around pronouns and gender. It's all this new stuff. How can I get used to it and stuff? And I really was curious about that. And in fact, when I started doing my own research beyond what I already knew, relative to the queer rights movement that we'll get into, is that actually being queer isn't new at all. So in fact, there's this pretty amazing resource that's linked here from the United Nations. And what this does is articulates just some of the examples around the world. They indicate that the gender queerness or variance in gender and also being gay or lesbian isn't new at all. One of my favorite stories actually is the graphic there of the two men you can see obviously from Egypt, and this is Nanagnam and Numatep, and they're I guess considered or believed to be among the first recorded same-sex couple in history, and there's a lot of indicators of why that is the case, and so and one of them is that they had this picture, let's say, or drawing on their tombs. And the way that they're positioned and everything kind of surrounding that really indicates that, because the way that they're holding each other is really reserved for those who are partners. And so when we think about queerness, it's not something that happened, in modern times. It's really been around for a long time. If you're interested to know more, I'll share the slides, or you can get them online afterwards, and you can take a look at the map, so to speak. And there's lots of different stories. I think where I'd like to focus, though, because a lot of us are in Europe or the United States, is really thinking about what was going on, I would say, particularly in the 18th to 20th centuries across Europe and the United States. And contextually, it's really important to have a think about historically what was going on. And I think one of the things that's a main event, so to speak, politically speaking, is that colonization was continuing to happen globally. This matters because the thoughts and the concepts, the politics, the social, what we accepted socially, all of that was kind of spreading around the world. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is really important, it's not going to come as a shock, is that men, particularly straight white cis men, were power holders. That means politically, socially, and financially. So when you think about contextually, why does this matter? Is because when we think about what we're going to be talking about, who names the things? Who describes what was going on medically or scientifically? It's typically these men that were the power holders. From a social and religious point of view, this is also a really important point, that procreation or a focus on procreation existed as the main reason for any kind of sexual relations. And I didn't really know this until I read a book that I'll reference here called The Invention of Heterosexuality. And it makes sense from a historical perspective, particularly when you think about the colonization of the United States. Religiously, it was important, but also from a social perspective, this emphasis on, look, you're getting together, men and women are getting together to populate, this new land that we're kind of creating, that sort of thing. So that's a bit of the mindset, to set the context around what was going on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and why that matters. And then the other thing that's really important is that science and scientific discovery was advancing, so, and we'll kind of get into historically why that matters as well. Just keep those things in mind as we go through. So what I'm going to do is start with this concept of what I call the invention of hetero and homosexuality. The reason why I mention this is because I was influenced by this book that I read over the past year called The Invention of Heterosexuality. In fact, kind of sexual relations between people is not new. However, the way that we talk about it and the way that we describe it and all of those things from a naming perspective happened at some point. And this is the story of how that happened. So the first person I'll talk about is this guy, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who was a German lawyer and also a journalist and a writer. And he holds a particular place, I would say, in queer history because he was the first. Some people describe him as the first out gay man. That's probably not, I guess, technically true. But if you think about the context that I set up, like what, kind of what do people care about? What do they, what sort of matters? In certain circles, he fit into that category of somebody who was listened to, let's say, because of his position and also his status, let's say. But he was out to his family, and he started writing about essentially being gay. These words were not words that were being used at that time. In fact, he created words really to describe what he would say relations between men, or like a man who loved a man was called a earning, or those who between women was called a dining. And he not just talked about it, but he published pamphlets and that sort of thing. What I learned through my own research over the past year is that pamphlets were a thing, kind of published and distributed, and that was a way to disseminate information within the academic community, but also the scientific community and politically as well. And so he was quite instrumental and in some ways kind of forgotten, but in more recent years celebrated for the work that he did. And he actually had a relationship with the next guy called Karl Maria Kertbeny, who was Hungarian. He was a human rights activist that kind of spread across the spectrum, let's say. But based on his writings and based on his letters and things like that, most people would suggest that he was a closeted gay man. He wrote about the importance of essentially what Carl was talking about as something that wasn't odd or anything. It should be politically acceptable, it should be socially acceptable, that sort of thing. But his sort of claim to fame is that he coined the terms heterosexual and homosexual. And he did that in a letter to Karl Ulrichs. And you can see there, dated the 6th of May, 1868. And then he started talking about it publicly in 1869. He was a writer, just like Karl Ulrichs, and he also self-published pamphlets and that sort of thing. And so he was an activist from a human rights perspective, but he had a particular interest, let's say, in these new terms that he created, which was heterosexual and homosexual. Now, just fast forward a little bit, just a few years, and I think also contextually why I talked about the importance of the advancement of science from an academic perspective and from a scientific perspective. This is the time where things are becoming a bit more solid. And you can imagine too, when you get information, you want to categorize it, start talking about it. It's really Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who was also a German scientist, who did a number of different things, but his one of his areas of interest was around sexuality, let's say. And he published this book, Psychopathia Sexualis, in 1886. And the importance of that is that it really describes for the first time, in a lot of different ways, what you would describe as aberrant, or what he would describe as aberrant sexual behavior. And this is when he defined homosexuality, and he talked about it from a an aberrant point of view. In fact, he described it as essentially a hereditary nervous disease. And the significance of that is because basically he didn't have any ill will. He was arguing for, in a political environment and also often a social environment, that really discounted or basically punished people who were gay, that they shouldn't. That it was, gay people couldn't help it. Homosexual people couldn't help how they showed up, and it was basically something that they needed to be treated. What's really important is that this time the term heterosexual, this I didn't know until I read this book actually, indicated also aberrant sexual behavior because it was driven by desire rather than procreation. So basically, socially, you could even say politically, and other contexts as well. Basically, if you were interested in sex, but it was for any other reason besides procreation, there was something wrong with you. So heterosexual as a term initially was coined as something that was aberrant, so basically outside the norm. This is important because we have this concept today that that's always been the case. The norm has always been heterosexual, but that isn't the case. There's a very specific political social context for what was accepted. Now, fast forward a little bit more at the late 19th and early century. I don't think I need to introduce Sigmund Freud. I think everyone's heard of this guy. He was a psychiatrist who was quite famous for a lot of things that he did, but I think in the context of queer history, the thing that's most important is that he helped, I would say, society through the medical community to transition from this concept of sexual pleasure or desire being something that's bad into something that's normal. And in doing that, what he did is basically then use this term heterosexuality that was widely adopted at this point in time as the new, basically within this new context of libido or something like that is normal. So I'm just let that sit for a minute because the reason why this is really important is because after that time, basically within the medical community, heterosexuality was considered normal. So it went from this basically term that was used to describe something that was aberrant or abnormal to something that was normalized. And also this idea that procreation was no longer the center of the reason for straight people to have sex, let's say. And everything outside of heterosexuality then was viewed as abnormal. We'll come back to that. What I wanted to take you back again, really to think about gender and sex in science. And so there's a slightly different path and it reaches further back. And the reason for that is because when you think about, in particular, our bodies, and when there's a way to observe difference that shows up in our bodies, and it's typically in intersex people. And so back to the Greek times, people like Aristotle and Galen, who are both physicians, philosophers, all of those things, basically had this sense, that all bodies didn't come out the same. And so they instead of doing what we do today, which have a concept that we'll get into, that's wrong. Basically, what they said is like, this is normal. And the way that they described it, even though they didn't necessarily agree on how it happened or why it happened, what they did agree on is that there wasn't a biological divide between male and female. In other words, there was this continuum, so this continued into the Middle Ages. And so, and there's a few different explanations, but one of my favorites is that I read about is that in the Middle Ages, there was this concept that a woman's uterus had 7 chambers, and there was this continuum from basically hot to cold. And based on where the baby came from, was basically described how they showed up into the world. So hyper masculine or kind of a little bit masculine, hyper feminine or a little bit feminine, or if you're in the middle, then you came out as intersex, and so that kind of showed up in your body. Obviously, there's some mysticism and various explanations because there wasn't the same understanding of our internal bodies as we might have today. All of that started to change slightly, I would say, later years. But I think that the main thing is that during the Renaissance, when there was a rise in, as we know, in kind of arts and culture, but also science, there's probably a little bit more investigation. And what happened was that there was a lot of difference in terms of understanding that how people viewed intersex people and therefore kind of gender medically. What was important though is politically and socially, there was pretty much a universal approach, that when you think about protecting the rights of man, and it was the man, they were keen on ensuring that there was a divide between men and women, so when you think about intersex people, there was this, you could almost feel like people starting to discard this idea of a continuum. And that's when when politically, socially, religiously, those contexts are really important. So fast forward again to the 1830s, and this is around the time that we talked about the kind of the invention of the words related to heterosexuality and homosexuality. This French guy, Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, founded a new science called teratology, and that really investigated the concept of abnormal births or unusual births, and so this included human beings. And so what was really interesting or really significant about his I guess concepts, but also kind of putting forward this idea, is that basically if we study this difference and understand it, we can understand what normal is. So you can explain an anomaly and then you can actually treat it and cure it. So basically it's the start of this concept that there is no continuum about male to female. Is simply you're a man or a woman, and if you're not either, then we need to figure out how to fix that. And then a contemporary of the chaps I was talking about before is Theodor Albrecht Edwin Klebs, who is a German scientist, and in 1876 he wrote some work. And the reason why this is so important is basically what he wrote about and convinced people is that the physiologically speaking, the absence or the presence of gonads really what defines sex. So the importance of this is because it's the first time in real scientific terms where a large portion of intersex people were erased. And so basically, there's this intense focus on saying, basically, if you look like this, you're a man. If you look like this, you're a woman. And there's no in between. And also, if we can't observe it, then basically, there's a decision of this or that. Now, what happened was in the early 1900s, as we kind of talked about, or what I talked about, is there's advancement in science. So there is a recognition, that there are some variances that we can observe, and it's really through things like biopsy and that sort of things that came into more prevalent use, using things like anesthesia and things like that we won't really get into. But basically what it meant is that alongside case studies that started to emerge. So I think in every society there's always somebody that says, I don't fit those categories, and actually this is the way I want to live my life, and that sort of thing. These started to occur, and I think it's I guess metaphorically speaking, muddied the waters a little bit, because scientifically and medically, people were confronted with the reality that basically somebody's saying, this is how I want to show up in the world, but medically and using these sort of strict criteria weren't really working. They didn't completely, medically speaking and scientifically speaking, they didn't completely move away from this idea that was put forward by Klebs, but but there was some movement, I would say, away from that. Now, in the 1930s, Hugh Hampton Young, who you can see there is known as the father of American urology, published a book, and it was really around genital abnormalities, hermaphrodism, which we now know as intersexism, and related adrenal diseases. That was in 1937. And the significance of this, and it wasn't with any malintent, I think it was as it was described and as I understand it, but I think it's basically, scientifically speaking, as I talked about, there was this real focus around fixing this problem, and so what he did is basically published this book and articulated surgically and also hormonally what you could do to fix somebody who is intersex. And so he set up this clinic, and people typically went there for, I would say, treatment. So it's not the end of the story, but it's the end of the story that I'll tell. And the reason for that is because the same kind of concepts exist today. And they haven't really shifted that much. And so if a baby is born intersex, the immediate thought is, how do you fix it, basically? How do you fix the problem? Which is quite prevalent. There is a movement. I'm not as familiar with it as I'd like to be. Led by intersex people saying, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't want to fix my body. But as we'll kind of get into, there's very little legal avenues, to protect intersex people. And there's still, I would say, a strong movement within the medical community to view it as a problem. The reason why this is important from a gender perspective is because the argument is still raging, and the newspapers every day about this idea of sex equals gender, but plenty of people, myself included, would argue that's not true. My body is my body, but how I show up from a gender identity perspective is completely separate. But historically, this is what we have to work with, from a medical community perspective. So where I wanted to go next is, how does that show up? And I think contextually it's really important to understand, where did the idea of homosexuality come from? And also where did it end up from a medical community perspective? Now, it's really easy to understand based on, kind of ending up with Sigmund Freud a little bit, that it's basically, a psychiatric disorder. And that's actually quite often the case when people talk about gayness or even gender identity. So what we're looking at here is a timeline, basically, of two different manuals. One is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. That's primarily used in the United States. It's I think, multi-volume, but it's a thick book, basically, that articulates all of the psychiatric disorders or mental disorders, in quite a lot of detail. The equivalent that's used mostly around the world is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, or the ICD. And you can see over time that based on a number of different factors, I'm sure, it gets revised. And so the first time that it was published around the 1950s, both of them actually classified homosexuality as a sexual deviation. So I think this is important because basically what it did is codify, so basically socially, politically, maybe there have been, issues for gay people, but in the medical community, they said, this is incorrect. It's like, there's something wrong with you, basically, if you show up as gay. We'll go through this timeline, but keep in mind too, there's the journey in terms of gender identity and expression, or gender identity, let's say, isn't dissimilar. The only difference is that there's still some, I guess, hanging on, within this community. But let's just focus around sexual orientation. So that was the 1950s. What we'll get into, and if you think about in the United States in particular, there was not just a movement around gay rights, but there was also things going around for women's rights, and also civil rights, primarily having to do with African Americans at the time. And so what you see here is a kind of a political social movement that helped influence changes within the medical community, particularly around homosexuality. And so it moves from being a sexual deviation to just a mental disorder in 1968. We'll talk about from a gay rights movement why that's important. And then just 5 years later, it was declassified as a mental disorder. But there's a lot of conversation, about that. And I think the recommendation that it was removed altogether. But still, there was a lot of resistance to that, politically, socially, et cetera, that we kind of talked about. So it was retained as a sexual orientation disturbance within the DSM. And you can see a similar sort of journey, I would say, within the ICD. And then in the 1980s, it is still there was something there. I mean, I don't know the meaning behind ego dystonic homosexuality, but there was some sort of retention. I think again, socially and politically, there were people that were adamant that it was retained. And then I think, well, that was removed in the late 80s, early 90s. I think the important thing from my perspective is that it wasn't until 2013 within the DSM that there was no diagnostic category applied to people based on their sexual orientation. The most interesting or disturbing thing is with the ICD, and this is when I first started talking about this, I think 2 or 3 years ago. It was not until the ICD-11 where declassification occurred relative to sexual orientation. That only came into effect, if you can believe it, like about 2 or 3 years ago. And the reason why I thought that was really interesting is because up until only like 2 or 3 years ago, there was still some retention within the ICD around sexual orientation being some sort of mental disorder of some sort that you could classify. So, from a medical perspective, that's all the background. I think also the social context is really important, and one of the things I really love to talk about. And I think part of this was sparked because about 4 or 5 years ago, I was starting to have conversations around this idea or this question: do we still need pride? You know, and it really kind of piqued my interest around, why is it that we have pride? Where did it come from, I suppose? And this gives you a historical perspective, obviously directed at the United States, primarily because a lot of what happened there ignited what happened globally. And hopefully you'll kind of get a sense of that. But I think most people, if they know anything about the gay rights movement, will have heard of Stonewall. But I wanted to go further back because it started before then. And it really started with, not started with, but I think publicly, what you can talk about and name, I would say, is the Mattachine Society in 1950. And the important part of this organization is that it was what was one of the first of its kind, and also that it was a semi-secret organization, so people showed up, and a lot of times people didn't use their real names. I think it was based out of LA in the first instance. But it's the top left picture of one of their protests. And what you can really gather, from looking at that picture is that what do you notice that's different from today? If you look at Pride today, it's quite not just colorful, but it's like basically people show up as themselves. The whole concept between the Mattachine Society protests is that we are civil. We look just like you, so the men dressed in suits, the women dressed in dresses. And basically they wanted to say that homosexuality is normal, and so which is very different, I would say, from today. But it was an approach, and I think they didn't want to cause big disturbances. Basically, they wanted to fight for their rights I would say, from a civil and social perspective. And so that's the choice that they made as an organization. The other organization of significance was the Daughters of Bilitis. It was basically founded and run and for lesbian women in 1955. And it was the first major organization that focused on women in this way. It had a similar sort of impact, I would say. The significance of this particular organization is they also produced a newsletter of sorts, or a magazine called The Ladder. And I'll also mention in the same sort of breath the publication called The Advocate, that some may know as of today. I'm not sure if it's still going, but it started in 1967. around about that same time, these publications were going on, what was called in the United States the Hays Code, which basically articulated what you couldn't show in movies and that sort of thing. Before 1968, there was no way you were going to show two men or two women together in any kind of sexual or love situation. And so when that was lifted, that caused a change. The reason why these things are important is because basically what we talked about is the definition of homosexuality, but also gender and intersex people and stuff was defined and regulated and everything from a medical point of view. What started to happen with the organization of the Majesty Society Daughters of Bilitis and also publications meant that they could say, almost we could start reclaiming our story and kind of tell our own stories. And also the lifting of the Hays Code is just one example of how you could then start to see stories being told in the popular media, movies or TV and things like that, of gay people showing up. And so before there was no organization, before there were no publications, and so there was no way to actually organize. The Advocate in particular had a publication circulation of 25,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if you imagine, before internet, before, phones and all of that, it was hugely instrumental in disseminating information about what was going on. And but what was really interesting though is that we often point to Stonewall, which I'll come to in a minute, is the seminal moment. But there's another really important event that happened, and it went almost completely undocumented, but there is a picture there of the Compton cafeteria riot in 1966. And the importance of this is that it was not necessarily the start of, but it was basically through organizations, through publications, that sort of thing, people started to recognize, hey, wait a minute, I exist, and it's okay for me to start to talk about that a little bit. And on occasion, it erupted. I'm going to come to Stonewall now because I want to talk about these two things in tandem a little bit, because they share some characteristics in common. So what happened on the 20th of June in 1969 were the Stonewall riots, and what happened was not dissimilar to what happened in the Compton cafeteria. So both venues were basically meeting places for the queer community. And the Compton cafeteria was kind of an overnight cafe, and a lot of, frankly, trans sex workers would come there after work, that sort of thing, and gather. And similarly, I would say the Stonewall Inn was known for that, not necessarily for just trans sex workers. In fact, there was a lot of information that you would suggest that they really favored white gay men. But in that particular night, there was a mix of people. And in both instances, though, what happened was that police essentially raided or caused a disturbance, that sort of thing. I think the importance in both instances is that the community said enough, and it's really the marginalized community, because the Stonewall Inn was kind of downtown Manhattan. It was run by the mob. It was not a nice place, like a wine bar that you might think of today, that sort of thing. It was like in the Compton cafeteria in a similar way. And so I think there is a stark contrast, between the picture of the Mattachine Society and kind of showing up that way to this community of people who found each other and basically were being disturbed and said, unrightly so, by the police. And at one point they said enough, so there's the story of somebody throwing a brick at Stonewall that kind of kicked things off. And a lot of that's true. I'll reference a particular podcast that I listened to a few years ago that was really interesting because it talks in detail about what really happened that night. But what it did do is ignited the spirit, I would say, of the queer community. In fact, there were 3 days of riots, I think, in Manhattan alone, as a result of that particular evening. And what it kicked off is that this organization, somewhat, I would say, influenced, by other organizations, and said, we need to get together, we need to do something about this. And so it was a year later, and that the first Pride parade happened in New York as a result of that, and it was a protest, I think. And then I think it was just 2 years later that it spread to London, and the first one happened in London in 1972, if I'm correct. But the other thing that I'll point out is that in the bottom left corner are two trans women. The one on the left is Marsha P. Johnson, and the one on the right is Sylvia Rivera. There's a lot of names associated with the gay rights movement in the United States, but these two are quite famous in that sense because, in fact, neither of them were there at Stonewall, but they were around it and also kind of voices, I would say. The importance is they were both trans women as well. So I think in terms of the modern gay rights movement, it was often led, from communities of people who were so marginalized, that they essentially pushed and pushed and pushed till they said enough. And they were also the ones that had the least to lose in a lot of ways. And so they kind of stood up and said enough. And so it kicked off, what we describe today is the Pride movement. The reason why we have Pride in June is often because of, in some places around the world. I know Australia just had theirs, I think, last month because it's summer, but it's often in June because of the Stonewall riots. The impact can't be understated because even the major gay rights movement or queer rights organization in the UK is called Stonewall. Where are we today then? So if you think about historically where we come from, certainly queerness is not new. Certainly there's been a move toward categorization, I would say, and definition to the point where basically if you're queer, there's something wrong with you, to this movement towards that's not true. We're gonna show up and we're actually going to kind of push against that and fight against it. And there are many places around the world where things are majorly different. However, this is just one view, of a map that talks about where it's illegal, basically, same-sex is illegal. There's an important point that I wanted to make here that is prevalent in all of the other stories that I was telling that kind of runs through as a current, because I think medically speaking and how homosexual people are described, I would say, it often leads out the lesbian experience. And one of the reasons for that, it goes back to this statement that I was making at the beginning, that men were in charge, and really from a political, social, religious perspective, men were at the center. In fact, there's a story I'll tell you really quickly, is that within the UK political system, somewhere around 1867 or something, a law was passed, that basically outlawed gay sex, but you didn't even need to witness, and everyone knows Oscar Wilde, and that's why he was convicted and sent to prison. In 1921, the Parliament had a debate and said we should add women to this statute or law, lesbianism basically, and the argument went something like this: well, there's really not that many of them, and if we talk about it openly, then we'll just encourage women to act that way. So it's basically this protective, paternalistic bullshit, which historically I'm sure makes a bit of sense, but in modern context, you're like, really? But I think what we see here, even in laws, is that it really focuses on the men, so sodomy laws and that sort of thing. There's often very little that talks about women and love between women. But still, the impact socially, politically, everything is still there. So there are many places around the world, either where being gay is illegal and maybe slowly changing. You can see that based on here. I think a more interesting picture personally is one around Europe. And so the IGLA does this every year. And what they basically do is look at the human rights situation of LGBTQIA people in Europe. And what it looks like without any numbers or anything like that, you can just look at it from a color perspective. And the deeper reds was where things are pretty bad. So from a human rights perspective, so let's say in Turkey, queer people have 4% of the rights as the human rights as their straight counterparts. And you might think things are pretty good in our part of the world, but in the UK, that kind of middle green, that means 54% of the human rights that straight people have, queer people have. I think the most disturbing one from my perspective, having looked at this for several years in a row now, is that there's little movement, but also there's little protection for intersex people. So what I talked about is there's no protection about bodily autonomy for intersex people. It only exists in places like Iceland, I think in Spain, and one other country where there is at least a law saying that if you're intersex, you're not forced, or parents can't make the decision, to medically do anything to their baby's body. This is important because you can imagine growing up and having had that decision made for you, but is it the right one? And there's probably a lot of controversy and discussion around that. But I think what this indicates is that we still have quite a long way to go relative to overall human rights. But hopefully what that gives you is a bit of perspective in terms of medically, scientifically, what was the story, about queer people, basically. A little bit about socially why things are transitioning and why things are shifting, I would say, is because there's a lot of agency, being taken back around the queer narrative and what we're about. There's more people coming into political power, and socially things are sort of moving. But these are the key takeaway messages that to leave you with, is that, first of all, queer people have always been part of our collective history. As long as there's been humanity, we've been here, and I think, and yeah, so it's not something that I accept, that it's a new thing, or even gender queerness and that sort of thing is new. It's not true. I think what I encourage people to do is really notice and point out where you see erasure or even inclusion of the queer narrative, or where it's plainly incorrect, because I think there's misinformation out there. One of the reasons why I love to talk about this in a way is because if we really know what happened and what the story was, then we're much better able to kind of talk about it. And I think the other thing I like to point out as well is that we're well, you all are here, so you're kind of seeking out listening to stories of queer people. One of the reasons for this isn't simply because it's a nice thing to do, but it's our collective human history. I'm interested in other people's experiences, and I want to understand, where people came from and historically what happened. I visited the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis when I was there a couple of years ago, and it shook me, but also because I didn't know all of the details, but I think it was really important to have that experience. Likewise, it's important that we understand and seek out and listen to queer people's stories. And I think also create space, for queer stories to be told, so we are seen and heard. I'm very open and willing to hear your reflections and questions. While you're having to think about that, though, what I just wanted to point out is some additional reading. So I mentioned The Invention of Heterosexuality by Jonathan Ned Katz. It's a really interesting book. It kind of changed my mind on a lot of things and helped me dive deeper into some of these people that I talked about in terms of their experience and why it mattered. But certainly, his approach is novel and kind of controversial. I think the book was published the first time in the 1990s, but it's still relevant today. And the other one that was really amazing to read is Sex in the Body by Anne Fausta Sterling. And this is, I can't even remember where I came across this one, but it also changed my mind. I didn't even get into like 10% of what she goes into, because I think what I wanted to focus on is the medical journey, particularly of intersex people. But there's a lot of content in there too about how gender shows up in our scientific research. That it was a bit shocking, I suppose, and not shocking in a way, but kind of our scientific approach to how we think about gender. So I can highly recommend that. And then there's one podcast, the second one there, you're wrong about, the Stonewall Uprising. It's not just entertaining, but hugely informative, because what they did is some research about what really happened and kind of talk about it in detail. And it's just a fascinating story, about what really happened and why, and gives you some insights into not just the Stonewall Inn, but I've had friends in my life who are older and kind of talk about similar experiences they had in Philadelphia or Chicago or places like that, where they had to be super careful, but also where they experienced some discrimination from police and that sort of thing. But then the other one that's pretty amazing is several series of a podcast called Making Gay History. If you're interested, the reason why is because this guy actually over the course of time did a lot of interviews, a lot of times with the people that were involved in the Mattachine Society or the Daughters of Bilitis, and those who were actually at the Stonewall Inn when it happened. So it gives you some more detailed insights into the characters and the people and really the reasons, why they're involved in such an important movement. And that's just about me. But yeah, because in addition to working with the Proud Science Alliance, I'm an independent consultant coach. This is one of the things I care about, but typically the way I describe it is I'm really interested in human performance in the context of work. And there's lots of different reasons for that. But find me on LinkedIn, or if you want to. I'm gonna pause there and I'll stop sharing. And I'm also going to stop recording.